one of the things that puzzles me in some sense is why doesn't Russia conceptualize itself as part of the West? Like, why does Russia insist upon viewing itself as an entity independent of the West, especially given the fact that it isn't exactly obvious that Putin is an admirer of what happened under Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union. And so I don't understand why we have to have this notion that it's Russia against the West. It's why he doesn't trust the West, we don't trust him. Like, what's the dynamic? I know they're trying to find a fourth way or something like that philosophically in Russia. Why are we in this situation where Russia doesn't conceptualize itself as part of the West? Well, I've tried to understand this Russian exceptionalism. I mean, I'm an admirer of Russian literature, and Solzhenitsyn certainly did feel that it would be appropriate for Russia, if it could throw off the shackles of its Soviet totalitarianism, to return to the Russian Orthodox tradition that undergirded the Tsarist regimes, let's say, and he felt that a return to that would produce the foundation that would allow proper movement forward. But that still, to me, doesn't exactly seem to justify claims that in some sense this is a non-Western enterprise. I mean, insofar as it's grounded in Orthodox Christianity, it's still grounded in Christianity, which makes it broadly Western. And people might be wondering why we've taken a detour into a religious direction, but the answer is we're trying to sort out the issue of the degree to which Russia rightly regards itself as an autonomous community independent of the West. And in order to answer that question properly, you have to delve down to the bottom of the cultural separation, and near the bottom is, well, the relative autonomy of the Orthodox Church. And I have talked to people in Washington who are associated with the Orthodox Church in Russia, and they do claim that Putin goes to confession and that there is some validity to his claims to have adopted some approximation of Orthodox Christianity. That obviously leaves open the issue of what the relationship is between the political power and the church power. It doesn't seem to be entirely unidirectional. And one of the things that also is a mystery to me in relationship to that is that you can trace a fairly clear line of development of democratic thought in the West proper to Protestantism in particular, which is grounded in Christianity. And there's a fair bit of emphasis on individual sovereignty in Orthodox Christianity, but there wasn't a development into a democratic polity in the same way there was, especially in Northern Europe. And I can't really understand why that is. It doesn't seem to be a doctrinal issue exactly that stems from the faith itself. Okay, so we've talked about why Russia might regard itself as somehow importantly separate. I mean, you could also say that about any number of countries within the West. It's not like Germany and England are the same place, or France and England, or France and the United States. We've been able to develop an integrated West to some degree that also allows for autonomy. So I still can't exactly see why the Russians can't be brought under that umbrella. Certainly the idea that they've lost their empire and they've lost their central place. Okay, so then is it the case then that, and this is part of the expression of political variability in opinion that you hear expressed in the United States right now. So, okay, well, we still have a question that's lurking constantly in the background. It's like, why in the world would the Russians are prone to reject an invitation to become part of the sovereign voluntary association of Western states? For some reason, they distrust the West. We've talked about that. They regard themselves as having an autonomous destiny, but hypothetically, that could have still happened. So let's take a slightly different tack. Let's imagine we're trying to figure out what did we do wrong in negotiating with the Russians in the last 20 years, and what did the Russians do wrong in conceptualizing themselves and in negotiating with us? Well, when things are going chaotically wrong, one of the simplest things to do always is to identify make a unitary assumption of cause and to make it external. It's convenient in 50 ways. First of all, it gives you an enemy to unite against. It gives you an enemy to talk about politically. It solves your conscience. It's also very simple because the reason that the former Soviet Union was so catastrophically chaotic in the 1990s, the reasons for that are unbelievably complicated and detailed. And they go all the way from the highest levels of government to the nature of arrangements within families, right? The whole society was authoritarian for, 70 years, murderously authoritarian. And to unravel that and to take responsibility for it and to figure out how to fix it is way harder than to blame almost all of it on an external enemy, especially when you're also motivated, as you said, by this sense of thwarted destiny, which we could identify. I mean, in the West, we do regard a certain degree of patriotism as noble and justifiable. And you can see how that, under some conditions, noble and justifiable motivation would get hijacked if there was also reason to externalize blame for conditions, for resentment generated by genuine chaos. Well, we already understand to some degree why. If the West is being conceptualized as an enemy responsible for Russian chaos, for keeping the Russians down, and for encircling them, depriving them of their just destiny, then we know the motive. There's others, but that's not a bad core motive. Now, here's a mystery. This could have happened at any time over the last 20 years or any time into the future over the next 20 years, but it happened now. And there are accusations of all sorts flying around on the political front in the West about why now. Is there a lesson in the fact that it's now for us? So I'll go into this a little deeper. I read a couple of papers by Victor Davis Hanson yesterday, and he made a claim that was approximately the following, which is that the Democrats, for example, under Obama, talked about Russia in a negative way, but really didn't do anything about Russia, whereas Trump gave Putin flattery in some sense, but actually did something about the potential danger they posed. And I'm not claiming that that's a valid argument or an invalid argument. It's just something that I read when I was trying to prepare for this. Why now? Because it is being politicized like mad in the West. We think, well, Putin is taking advantage of our perceived weakness, and there's partisan reasons for that, and maybe there's deeper philosophical reasons for that. Those need to be separated. And then we do need to get to also maybe how we stepped into this, even if it was only 20% our fault or 2%, I don't care. What did we do wrong that made this happen and happen now? Well, the best explanation I've heard so far, and it goes along with this gradualist idea in some sense, is that part of what Putin did while he was attempting to wrest back control of Ukraine, let's say, is build a military presence on the border. And then the fact that you've done that actually changes the situation substantially. If you're much more likely to shoot someone with a gun if you happen to be holding it and pointing it at them as a precursor. And so you could see how a gradualist approach, and his initial idea might have just been, well, we'll build up the military to put even more pressure on the West and to continue this gradualist approach. But once it's there, the situation changes. And then it could be, in some sense, relatively small and relatively random events that precipitate it at any given moment. Okay, so he's having a lot more trouble locally than he might have expected for a multitude of reasons. Poor organization to begin with, which seems in keeping with the notion that the troops were put there as an intimidation rather than as a reliable military force for an invasion. And also the Ukrainians are entrenching and fighting back with a ferocity that was unexpected. They have more to lose in some sense than the Russians have to gain. So that's always dangerous. That's a dangerous inequality in morality in warfare, and that's not to be underestimated. And so what's happening on the international front in response to the cohesiveness of the response to the invasion? So the West is united, well, the world is united, and Putin is having a lot of trouble on the ground, and he wasn't well prepared either on the propaganda or the military front, and he's going to suffer substantial economic costs. And so this, at the moment, this does not look like it's going well for him. Okay, so we could be happy about that, except that there are also nuclear weapons, and that's always something to think about. How do we not, what's the right reaction? What do you think is an intelligent pathway forward? Because I was wondering, we start to funnel in defensive weapons. Well, at what point, now we should be the global community, not the United States, to the degree that that's possible. And then, but it's still, at what point does the funneling of defensive weapons become active engagement in the war process?